In this section, we're going to try to get our heads wrapped around the basic fundamentals of how an internal combustion engine works. And we're going to do that by looking at 4 different topics. We're going to first start looking at just basic functions and parts of an internal combustion engine. Then we're going to go into a little bit more detail looking at 4-stroke engines and then at 2-stroke engines and what the differences are there. And then we'll finally look at some different common engine configurations that we'll run into. So let's first tear into basic functions and parts. And before we start looking at engines and parts, let's understand really what an engine is doing. So an engine is converting energy, and it's taking energy from fuel like we have in gasoline or diesel or a lot of other different fuels that we might use, so ethanol or LP gas or something like that. And we're going to combust it or burn it. So we'll talk about combustion, and combustion really means burning. So we're going to burn it. And when we burn it, 2 things happen. So for one thing, it gets hot. So we get a heat buildup. And the other thing that happens is that it expands. It builds up pressure. And so it's that pressure buildup and the thermal energy that we're going to use to activate some kind of a piston here. And ultimately what we want to do is make a shaft rotate. So we want to make it crank. So that's what we're trying to do is activate this and make it work. So how does that work? Well, before we get tearing into engine parts, let's think about a common example of this type of an energy conversion device. A bicycle is a great example of that. Many of us ride bicycles. So your leg has energy in it, the muscles in your leg, and those legs are pushing down on the pedal. And as it pushes on a pedal, that pedal is a crank, and it's connected to a crankshaft over here, and it's making that shaft rotate. And that's what we want to happen. We want that shaft to rotate, and then we can connect it, in this case, with a chain to a back wheel of a bicycle or something like that. In an engine, we might be connecting it to a transmission or a lot of other different things to make some mechanical system work. And so we will look at all these pistons, and you see some animations of pistons over here going up and down. Same concept as your leg pushing on a pedal to make the thing go. So let's look a little bit more at some piston parts. So we need to understand some of this terminology. So as we talk about these things, we're going to understand together what we're looking at. So fundamentally, the part of this system that goes up and down is the piston. So that's the main thing that's moving up and down. So that's analogous to like your leg on the bicycle. It's pushing that thing up and down, okay? It is ultimately connected to, and what we ultimately want to happen is this crankshaft down here to rotate. So that's the rotating part. That's what's going to come out of the engine that's going to turn and make something work, make a lawnmower blade spin or a snowblower or whatever that we have it connected to, okay? So that's that rotating shaft. So that rotating shaft has an offset in it, like the pedal on your bicycle, so that you can get that thing rotating and get that crank action going, okay? So that's why we call this a crankshaft, because it's kind of got that crank on it that rotates. And so you've got this offset here. Now this main part that connects the piston down to this crank is what we call the connecting rod. So that's kind of like almost like the lower part of your leg, if you will. So that you can think about that as your leg. This joint right in here is the pedal, and then this offset is your crank that's connected to the crankshaft. And again, this piston is the main thing that goes up and down. Now what we have going on up above that piston, this is what we call the combustion chamber. So this is where we're going to put the fuel in there and we're going to light it. We're going to combust it. We're going to make it burn. And when it burns, it's going to expand. And when it expands, what that does is push this thing down, kind of like your leg pushing down on that bicycle pedal. So that combustion is going to push it down. That's what's going to make this crank rotate. And then we're going to have some other things going on when that piston comes back and comes back up. So it's just going to be going up and down in there. And so, you know, there's some other things going on. That's what we're going to kind of wrap our head through and look at different ways of ways that actually happens for us. Okay, so those are the fundamental parts there. So we got this crankshaft down here that we want rotating. We have a connecting rod that connects that piston to the crankshaft. The piston is the main part that moves up and down in here. The combustion chamber is up above that. And then the outside of this, we often talk about the cylinder. So the outside part that this piston moves up and down inside of, we talk about as the cylinder. So that's the cylinder. Those are the main parts of that, okay? So we're going to tear into that, and there's two fundamental types of engines, really. There's more, but two basic ones that we most often work with. And they're divided up by the cycles or the strokes. And we'll talk about that terminology a little bit. Cycles, 4-stroke, 4-cycle, what all this stuff. We'll try to unpack that and get a little bit of that confusion out of the way, all right? So primarily we have either a 4-stroke or a true 2-stroke engine. Those are the primary two things. I'll show you a rotary engine, which are kind of cool, and they kind of boggle your mind a little bit of how they work. But we'll look at that. But these are the two main ones that we look at. And that's the functional part, how the piston works and how the combustion works above that piston, and the sequence of things that happen in that engine over and over and over many, many times really, really fast. And so that's what we're gonna go through next. The other thing that I'll mention at this point is there's really two types of ignition. And, you know, commonly we'll talk about a gasoline engine or a diesel engine, but really we want to be a little bit more general than that, than just talking about the fuel that goes into it. And we're going to divide those by a spark ignition or a compression ignition engine. So then this really comes down to how we light that fuel in the combustion chamber. So in a gasoline engine, which is really a spark ignition engine, we light it with a spark. So there's a spark plug in there, and we'll see all this later on. But that spark is what ignites that fuel and makes it burn. But that's not only gasoline. So ethanol, liquid petroleum gas, natural gas, a lot of other fuels that we use in engines or mixtures of some of these will use this same type of a spark ignition. So we're going to differentiate it that way. In a compression ignition engine, we don't need a spark. So we basically compress that fuel. When it gets compressed enough, it explodes. It just burns, it combusts. So, and again, we'll go through some fuel properties and get our heads wrapped around that as well. And so we don't need the spark up there. It's just the compression that ignites that. That's not going to work well for gasoline or ethanol or some of those fuels, but it will work well with diesel and biodiesel and some different fuels like that. And so though we're going to differentiate that way. And so as we start talking about these engines, I'll start talking about the ignition, when we ignite that fuel and get it to start to burn. And that's how we differentiate either a gasoline or a spark ignition engine and a compression ignition engine. So where we're going from here, let's go back up. We're going to go back up to these cycles and strokes and try to figure out, okay, how does this all work? How does it go together?